Welcome back to the Wealth Actually podcast. I'm Fraser Rice. ProPublica has taken on the role abdicated by most mainstream news organizations. Its long-form journalism, while controversial, takes on many special interests that escape public scrutiny. While I often don't agree with the slant that they take, ProPublica represents a new frontier for the fourth column. Traditional news outlets make less and less business sense. With that in mind, I wanted to find out more about how long-form journalism is going to work going forward. I'm also interested in how it will apply to financial regulation. So I spoke to Justin Elliott, an investigative reporter at ProPublica. Justin has won the Gerald Loeb Award for Business Journalism, the Selden Ring Award for a series on the American Red Cross, and, with the Trump Inc. podcast team, a DuPont Columbia Award. He co-wrote the story revealing tech mogul Peter Thiel's multi-billion-dollar Roth IRA, which we talk about here. Welcome aboard, Justin.
Hey, good to be here.
Well, this is a treat because I happen to think that the function of journalism, et cetera, is even more important now than ever, especially in terms of helping people understand where the legislative process fits in and how wealth is managed, generally speaking. Before we get into that, let's talk a little bit about what ProPublica does and how it's funded, how it works, those types of things.
Yeah, so ProPublica, we're a 501c3 nonprofit, and we're now, I think, around 150, 160 people total based in New York, where I'm based. We were founded back in the mid-2000s by a guy named Paul Steiger, who had been the editor of the Wall Street Journal. And the idea, in a nutshell, was that investigative reporting is expensive, and people like me, we sometimes go months and months without actually producing a story. And back in the mid-2000s was a period when it was becoming clear that the traditional business model of newspapers that funded this kind of reporting was in serious crisis. It's only gotten worse since then. And so the idea was that you would have a nonprofit that focused just on investigative reporting that has some sort of accountability angle, journalism in the public interest. And instead of relying on vagaries of the advertising and subscription market, it would be funded by philanthropists and therefore potentially more stable. And so we publish on our website, ProPublica.org. But another part of our model is all of our stories are published under what's called a Creative Commons license, meaning that they can be reprinted by other publications for free. So when I publish a story, sometimes it's just on the website, but other times it will be published simultaneously on our website, but also in a newspaper. So, one time I wrote a story about a congressman from Indiana, and that story ran in the Indianapolis Star. And so the idea for us, because we're getting funded not by advertising revenue or subscriptions, we just want the distribution, and for the newspaper, they're getting free, what we hope is high quality content. And so we cover basically the whole range of anything you can think of: healthcare, business, politics. We're nonpartisan. So it's essentially like an old school newspaper investigative team, but that's the entire organization.
Interesting. And a way to sort of try to flesh out what the economics of journalism looks like going forward. And this is one way that it's being approached. You really have a sterling reputation vis-a-vis sort of writing about finance and some of the issues related to that, and things that really, in a sense, sort of demand accountability, or at least an extra look. And we'll get into that in a second. Maybe take a second to sort of talk about your background and how you got into writing about finance and wealth and everything related to the tax code that may or not be used properly or improperly.
My background is actually originally not in studying finance or business in any kind of formal way. I went to Brown University. I studied history and classics, read a lot of Latin poets and that sort of thing. But in college, I got into journalism through the student newspaper at Brown and sort of got hooked. And then and ended up deciding I wanted to do that, as a career, or try to. And I worked for several online publications, but I've been at ProPublica for a while now, since 2012. So I guess I just had my my 12th anniversary at ProPublica. And I originally was really more of a political reporter, but I started getting into writing about business, working with another journalist who's now my editor, a guy named Jesse Eisinger, who was a reporter at the Wall Street Journal for a long time. And he and I, back when he was a reporter at ProPublica, wrote some stories about the world of antitrust policy that involved delving into a lot of both legal and economic issues. We actually wrote a long story about this industry of academic economists who, as a kind of side gig, do consulting for companies trying to show that their mergers are going to be pro-competitive and trying to convince the government not to sue to block their mergers. So I actually sort of change what I'm writing about every couple years and jump around. But I also have written a fair amount actually about taxes, but also about tax preparation. Another colleague and I spent a couple years writing about the history of how we do tax prep in this country. And that was a lot about the company Intuit, which makes TurboTax, and why, there's this kind of intermediary between most taxpayers and the government that doesn't exist in a lot of other developed countries. And so I think one of the great parts about the job being a journalist is you're kind of a permanent student and you have a license to just call people up and ask them to talk to you and explain things to you. And so that's how I've learned about how the world of business and taxes and other things work.
So let's talk a little bit about one of your famous stories, which is around Peter Thiel and his use of the Roth IRA to use the tax-free power of compounding to turn what looked like really pretty speculative situations into gigantic assets that are held in a tax-free shelter in many ways. How did you get involved and started on that? And maybe take us through what you discovered.
Sure. So that story was part of a broader project we did that we called the Secret IRS Files. And this was a pretty extraordinary situation where ProPublica received a set of tax returns or tax return data of thousands of the wealthiest people in the country, people like Jeff Bezos and Elon Musk. Some people you've heard of, some people you haven't heard of, and of course, tax returns are not a matter of public record. There's a lot of things as a reporter that I can get just by calling up some government agency or filing a formal public records request. And tax returns, at least at this point in U.S. history, are not that. So this is something that was leaked to us at the time that we got it. We actually didn't know the identity of the source. I was brought on to a team of reporters at ProPublica to look at this material and try to decide, is there something newsworthy here? Are there things that are worth trying to flesh out and understand better and write stories about? This is not something that we took lightly because, again, this information is usually not public. And we're not the New York Post or the Daily Mail. We're not going to publish stories or TMZ. We're not going to publish stories just because they're salacious or might be interesting to some people. Or we're not even Forbes. We're not going to publish stories just about different ultra wealthy people's net worth. Although, not that I think there's anything wrong with that, but that's just not something that we thought was an appropriate use of this material. So we ended up doing a long series of stories about how the wealthiest people in the country are avoiding taxes in various ways, and in various cases, at least arguably, in ways that in some cases actually could be illegal. In other cases, are legal, but at least some people would argue are kind of not what Congress intended when it passed various parts of the tax code. The story that I did with a couple of colleagues, James Bandler and Patricia Callahan, about Peter Thiel's Roth IRA was a really interesting education in this part, kind of sleepy seeming part of the tax code of retirement benefits. So the history of the Roth is back in the 90s. Congress decided, and it was a bipartisan thing, that they wanted to add a new incentive for middle class people to save for retirement. The Roth from Roth IRA comes from a Senator William Roth, a Republican of Delaware. This was sort of his brainchild. And the basic way a Roth works, and I'm sure most, if not everyone listening, has one, I have one, is you're allowed to put in a relatively small amount of money every year, a few $1,000s, although it sort of changes every year how much you can put in. And this is money, this is after tax money, unlike a traditional IRA. And then you can invest that money, and the money grows inside this Roth IRA shell tax free. So any interest or dividends that get thrown off your investments are not taxed as they would be if you were just making them normally in your brokerage account. And then the real big benefit comes in when you withdraw that money. As long as you withdraw it after you're age 59 and a half, you are not paying any tax on the withdrawal, any income tax. And so this was, again, explicitly intended by Congress as a way to essentially subsidize middle class people to save more money for retirement. And it was specifically targeted middle class people in the law because they put an income cap on who could contribute money to a Roth. And again, it's changed over time, but I think now it's around like $150,000. If you make more than that, you can't contribute to a Roth. So what we reported is that Peter Thiel, the well-known VC billionaire out in Silicon Valley, was able to amass, as of 2018, $5 billion fortune inside of this tax-free Roth IRA. And we were able to trace through various people we talked to and records how he did that. And the short version of it is, unlike a normal person like me who would put a few $1,000s into my Roth and then buy like a Vanguard index fund or something like that, what Peter Thiel did in the late 1990s was he put a couple $1,000s into his Roth and then purchased founders shares of company he was involved in that became PayPal into the Roth. So he was able to get, I believe it was like 1.7 million shares of this company that became PayPal into his Roth, purchasing those shares at like a fraction of a cent each. PayPal later sold to eBay. That ballooned into, I believe, tens of millions of dollars. And then he was able to keep making tech VC investments through the Roth, and most notably, including his early investment in Facebook. And so as a result of this, he has this absolutely massive fortune. Again, it was $5 billion as of 2018. I would be shocked if it was not much higher now, given what's happened in the market. And the US government has, lost, in our story, we estimated that it could be well over $1 billion of tax revenue. And I'm very comfortable saying this is not what Congress intended when they created the Roth, because of the guardrails they put on it, which we can get more into. And also, we explored in the story, some of the lawyers we talked to said that at least potentially was illegal because of the valuation issues around, were the shares that he originally bought back in the late 90s, were those actually at fair market value, or were these artificially valued at a low price in order to get as many of shares as possible into the tax-free Roth shell? So there's a lot we don't know about this, but that was like some of what we explored in the piece.
One of the interesting things, and then sort of in my day job, it's, the tax code is big and full of weirdness and craziness that sometimes you can take advantage of or not take advantage of. In hearing you describe it, it's sort of like, okay, the Roth was there. He took advantage of the code in the sense that if you had money to buy valueless things, let's call it that for the moment, and then, in a sense, you took a chance on that a little bit, that could have turned to zero just as easily as it turned into PayPal or eBay or Google or anything else that explodes like that. And then once you have that, you actually have the currency to go and diversify and make other bigger bets and have it really work like that. It sounds to me like this is as much a valuation issue as you described, and that the note from the third party valuation firm is almost 100% at fault here, as much as the design of the program. Would you agree with that, or is that something that I'm sure that the program can be designed further, and maybe that goes to maybe forced liquidations at a certain asset size or something like that. But on one hand, I very much agree that these types of accounts weren't meant to have $5 billion in them, sort of full stop. On the other hand, it's sort of like, look, that those are the way the rules were set up, and absent, let's call it, fraud at the valuation level and making sure that that was documented correctly, he kind of did what he was allowed to do. How do you think about that?
So it turns out, something I learned about while I was reporting on this, there's actually a whole industry around making kind of non-traditional IRA investments. These are called self-directed IRAs. So again, normal, not rich person like me, and both not rich and not particularly adventurous in my investments, I'm putting $5,000 or something every year into my IRA and buying like the Vanguard Total Stock Market Index or something like that. But if you want to be more adventurous, you can. There's some limitation. There's some restrictions on what you can invest in, but you can invest your IRA into a lot of different things. As you say, absolutely one of the key issues here is valuation, and there's a lot we don't know about that in this case, because back in 1999 when this happened, the annual cap on how much cash you could put into a Roth IRA was actually $2,000. I think it's something like $6,000 or $6,500 now. So very low cap. So you're right, he was making a bet, but it wasn't a very big bet. Even if it had gone to zero, I don't think no one would have really felt it. So when you think about this for a second, okay, if you can put $2,000 in, you can buy the S&P 500 index fund, but it's to your advantage if you can get something that's very valuable into the Roth and still argue that it's somehow under this $2,000 cap. And that's the valuation issue. We don't know exactly what the discussions were around the valuation of these, what are called founder shares of the company at the time. In our reporting, we were able to piece together some of the details through some of the SEC filings around that company going public. Peter Thiel himself, who didn't comment for our story, did talk a lot about this, actually in a citizenship application for New Zealand, where he now has like a kind of bunker-like property. And this citizenship application in New Zealand had come out actually in the New Zealand press, and in it he talks about his assets and his kind of financial story, and they talk about how they did this. I don't actually know if there was a third-party valuation firm or if this is something that was just signed off on by the lawyers for the startup at the time. It's a great question. I wish I knew more. What we do know is that we spoke to several lawyers who do this self-directed IRA work as their bread and butter. And what they told us is there's actually a term for the misuse of an IRA in this way that I'm not saying Peter Thiel is guilty of this, but they were raising questions about it. And the term is stuffing. You're not supposed to stuff assets into the tax-free shell of the IRA that are in reality worth more than the contribution cap. And so we presented this to these lawyers that do this every day, and they said they had serious questions about whether that had gone on here. And we just don't know. And possible the IRS has looked into this, but even if the IRS has looked into this, that almost never becomes public unless there's a lawsuit. So it's really an open question whether this was a case of, what people call legal tax avoidance or illegal tax evasion. And by the way, even if it potentially was illegal tax evasion, there's also questions around statute of limitations and whether it would even matter at this point.
Right.
But I'm no lawyer.
I am, and I don't know. But
Yeah.
in your reporting, you obviously were, called the IRS up, I'm sure, and said, what gives here? This looks not only outsized, but a distortion of what was intended. Uh, did they respond? How did that work?
Yeah, so we go through, and this is, common. This is standard practice for any kind of responsible journalist. We have what we call a no surprises process, where any significant person or organization in a story, we don't want them to be surprised by anything that we publish, and so for various reasons, chief among them being a basic commitment to fairness and wanting to get the story right, we go to the people we're writing about, Peter Thiel, the IRS in this case, and present before publication and present all of the information we're considering putting in a story and ask them for, if they want to weigh in. This sometimes happens in writing, sometimes happens in the form of interviews. In this case, Peter Thiel didn't comment. The IRS didn't comment, which is actually very much the IRS's standard response. But I will say this is not an issue that is specific to Peter Thiel. What Peter Thiel did is quantitatively quite different, but qualitatively, there's a lot of people that have tried to do this, and this is something that actually has been on the government's radar for a long time. Well before our story was published. The GAO, which is the investigative arm of Congress, has actually done a series of studies drawing in part from IRS data that the public doesn't have access to, looking at how there are some IRAs, both traditional IRAs and Roth IRAs, that have gotten incredibly large, and the GAO has raised questions about whether this is, again, what Congress intended when they created these programs. We looked at several other people that had large IRAs. Peter Thiel by far had the largest, like not even close, 5 billion. And I think that the next biggest we saw was a few hundred million, which is still pretty nice. I mean, I think at the time of our story, the average Roth IRA in the country, or either the average or the median, was something like $40,000. But we actually did get a comment from a guy named Ted Weschler, who's a longtime Berkshire Hathaway executive who had an IRA that I believe was around $250 million level. And he actually provided a statement that we included in our story describing how that happened, which was quite different than Peter Thiel. It involved just a series of more traditional investments that went to the moon. And what Ted Weschler told us was that what he did, according to his statement, was totally legal and within the rules, but he explicitly told us that he thought this is not what the program was for, and that it was essentially being used in ways that Congress hadn't intended and perhaps should be reformed.
Congressional intent, fixing the problem, creating a patch to, inject something that reduces the distortion I was talking about before, where you have a $5 billion RIA. As you look at it, you were, have written about politics, et cetera, and you look at where things are, and you have the Ron Wydens of the world who take a specific interest in distortions in the tax code and areas where people really try to, flex and make it work for them. How do you think about that? Is Congress really just falling down on the job here, or is the tax code to blame, and sort of the metastasis that has gone through? How do you think about that, and what's your opinion on that front?
I think the tax code is to blame, but only to blame if you think this is bad. I mean, these are Congress can make, can do pretty much whatever it wants within the bounds of constitutionality when it comes to the tax code. I think what is indisputably true in this case is that what Peter Thiel has done and what a number of other people have done are completely far afield from what Congress intended with this program. And this is, these are what are called tax expenditures. When Congress creates a tax break like the Roth IRA, it's essentially spending money, because this is money that would be going to the U.S. government otherwise. They call that in the policy world, they call that tax expenditure. So the question is whether you think this is a good use of federal government money, or a good reason that the federal government would not get taxes that it would otherwise get. a lot of people in Congress think that, do want to patch this, as you said. And there have been proposals, for example, to cap the amount of money you can have in a Roth. So, if it gets to $100 million, you're forced to withdraw after that. And so there are totally easy ways that this particular issue could be addressed if tomorrow, if Congress wanted to do it. But I think, one of the interesting things about writing about taxes is, it really gets to what are the values of Congress as being expressed in the tax code in a way that, is stripped of all of the, rhetoric and mystifications. You can look at the numbers and look at how the rules work and how that's playing out in the real world. And, for better or worse, this is what our elected representatives have come up with.
Really interesting. As you've written about the situation and other ones in the secret IRS files, et cetera, what are you looking at now? What is drawn your interest? There are plenty of tax loopholes to take a look at, I'm sure, and there's plenty of distortions that have created a lot of wealth elsewhere. What are you seeing out there, or what sort of story ideas are you interested in right now?
Yeah, I think after writing about taxes for a number of years, I became very convinced that taxes are undercovered as a topic in sort of the mainstream press. And the reason I say that is just the amounts of money at stake are so large. I mean, you'll see journalists writing articles about kind of, municipal corruption scandals, or if you look at the Senator Robert Menendez corruption case that's going on right now in New Jersey. These are ultimately I'm not at all minimizing it because there's allegations that you have a U.S. senator who's taking cash and maybe even gold bars in exchange for official acts. But the amounts of money we're talking about there are, I don't know off the top of my head, but we're talking six figures, maybe low seven figures. When you start writing about taxes, some of these provisions are, hundreds of millions, billions of dollars, tens of billions, hundreds of billions in revenue. So just huge amounts of money. And I think the challenge as a reporter writing about it is that ordinary people, their eyes tend to glaze over when you're writing about taxes, when you're writing about numbers and things that get a little bit complicated when it comes, in a mathematical or financial sense. So it's a challenge to write about it. I'm not writing about taxes right now. Some of my colleagues still are. I have actually been assigned to cover the 2024 presidential campaign. And although that also, of course, intersects with business and financial matters, we've been looking at, for example, former President Trump's new social media company that is just a fascinating story involving SPACs and meme stocks, at least arguably. And this what appears to have happened is this company that basically doesn't do anything yet, or I mean, it does. It creates this website, True Social, but they have basically no revenue. Has created, I think, at current market value, at least on paper, something like $2 or $3 billion of paper wealth for former President Trump. So it's an incredible story. And I think there's, for example, on that front, there's still parts of that story that have not been told, and we're kind of poking around.
Well, maybe it's in his Roth IRA. But,
that would be quite a twist.
And to get back to your comment about the dollars raised, it becomes even more important as we look at healthcare and transportation infrastructure and defense spending, et cetera. These things, in many ways, at the federal level, in theory, we can print our way out of this, or maybe even deeper into it. But at some point, the match between revenue and expenditure, if only for a justice perspective, probably has to align a little bit better than it does. And that it sounds to me like that's what a lot of your writing is. That's a theme that's important.
Yes, certainly, and I think that's obviously even more relevant now that we're out of the era of ultra low interest rates and things like the government debt's not as easy to carry as it was 5 or 6 years ago. I mean, another major theme we wrote about that I find fascinating that I didn't really understand until delving into this as a journalist is the different ways that people that make money in different types of businesses get treated by the tax code that frankly seem kind of arbitrary to me. So one thing that we wrote a lot about is how people like Elon Musk, Jeff Bezos, Mark Zuckerberg, whose wealth derives from assets, how they can avoid federal income tax in a way that, an ordinary W-2 wage earner like me can't. But also, interestingly, if you are somebody, depending on how your business is structured, if you can't avoid income, you're going to be paying a lot more than the Mark Zuckerbergs of the world. So we actually wrote about how there have been years where Elon Musk and Jeff Bezos have paid less taxes than me. And I mean that not in the sense of a lower tax rate. I mean literally lower in dollar figure terms, because there have been years when Elon Musk and Jeff Bezos have paid $0 in federal income taxes. And how is that possible? Well, I'm sure it won't be surprised to most of the people listening. The reason that's possible is they don't draw salaries from their companies, or to the extent they do draw salaries, they also have negative income that wipes that out. And the source of their wealth is the value of Amazon or Tesla or Facebook, Meta going up. And as I'm sure you well understand, it is possible to consume that wealth in a way that doesn't generate taxable income. And that is, there's many ways, but essentially borrowing against it. This is the famous phrase, or has become somewhat famous in recent years, buy, borrow, die, which I'm sure you're very familiar with. And so one of the fascinating things that came out of this reporting and that we wrote a lot about was even among people who are at the very tippy top of the wealth scale of the country, the tax code treats them radically different. Like Elon Musk versus somebody who owns, a partnership of, like, for example, the Uline family, not as much of a household name as Musk or Bezos, but they own the company that is the largest distributor of cardboard boxes and other supplies like that in the country. Because of how that company is organized and the fact that it's generates massive amounts of income, they have a huge tax bill every year. Whereas a Musk or a Bezos, unless they're selling stock, they don't. And I think, again, looking at that, the question is this how we want it to work? Is it fair? Is it generating the revenue that we want? And these are all obviously value judgments, but things start to get haywire when you stop having W-2 income.
No question that asset wealth and income wealth are treated dramatically differently. Even carry tax treatment, the carried interest in certain things having capital gains treatment versus income treatment, when it's really nebulous as to how that works. Another example where the logic doesn't necessarily follow the code.
Right. And also, I mean, going even bigger picture, how the tax code treats debt versus equity. And you can talk to tax law academics all day about how they think that should be changed. Is it actually fair? Is it producing the outcomes that we want? So it's really a very rich area intellectually, and once if you can get past a lot of the acronyms and jargon, it's fascinating.
Well, it's an important debate. Justin, really good stuff. Thanks so much. And again, I don't want to sort of underemphasize the role that journalism and well-funded journalism plays in society. So I appreciate what you do on that front. I may not agree with everything, but that's the source of debate. And I think that's something that's important for this country going forward.
Thank you. And by the way, if anyone out there has either story ideas or criticism or praise, my contact info is on our website, on all my stories, justin@propublica.org. Thanks so much.
I'll have that on the show notes. Justin, appreciate you being on, and continued success.
Thanks so much.